Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. This week, we're back with Ericka Taylor for part 2 of the conversation around the racial wealth gap. Let's tune in. Yeah. And so I think that leads me into my next question. Now that we've talked about how race and racial capitalism created the wealth divide, I want to just touch on last year you wrote an article titled The Deep Roots of the Racial Wealth Gap and How We Can Undo It. I'll definitely be sure to link the article in the show notes, but if you could just give an overview when we talk about the racial wealth gap, what do we mean? And then what did you uncover in this article in terms of the deep roots of the racial wealth gap?
Absolutely. When we talk about the gap, just to go into the sort of the actual numbers, let's look back at immediately after slavery in 1865, after emancipation. Not surprisingly, Black people only owned about 0.5% of the national, 0.5% of the national wealth. So fast forward to 2019, and that number had grown to a dramatic 2%, which is absurd and obscene, but again, just sort of shows what exclusion and predatory inclusion can do. And so by 2019, white folks had the collective median wealth was $188,200. So it's $188,200 for median wealth of white folks. The median wealth of Black families, $24,100. $24,100. And if you look at the growth over the years between 83 and 2016, adjusting for inflation, median wealth for white families increased by 33%, and for Black families, wealth decreased by more than half. And this is all data that comes, we're still sort of assessing out data from the pandemic because it's going to take a while to have the full, understanding of what's causal, what's the cause, so that's the gap in numbers. And again, the implications of those gaps are great. As I mentioned earlier, the roots really go back to colonization. And then once we have the establishment of this country, continue to have models where you have sort of freebies for folks who aren't Black. Think about the homesteading program, which some folks might know about, but homesteading program basically gave people rights to land that had been stolen from Native Americans. But you go on claiming if you're able to stay on the land for 5 years, it becomes your land for pennies on the dollar. So folks come over and basically it's given free land, and then if they can maintain it for 5 years, it is their land. You move forward. Only a tiny fraction of Black folks were able to participate in that. So then you have this white wealth being created because again, this is land, this is property. It continues to increase in value, and you can use that, especially after the New Deal, and then you can use that to leverage on a loan in your home, what have you, to like send your kids to school. Black kids and other kids of color are far more likely to take out debt. And Black folks are also coincidentally more likely to go to graduate school. Black undergrad students are more likely than white people to go to graduate school, but they're also more likely to carry that debt. And even when you look ahead at just little things like the tax system. Yeah. Well, so Dorothy Brown is a professor. She was at Emory. Now she's here in D.C., I think at Georgetown. But she wrote a book called The Whiteness of Wealth. And she examined how all these seemingly sort of race-neutral policies, in fact, are not. So if you're a homeowner, you can claim interest up to I forget the exact numbers, but huge amounts. I think maybe $300,000 to $400,000 of interest that you can claim a year. And there, as we've established, far more white homeowners in the U.S. than there are Black homeowners, largely because of this New Deal. And you have to home in advance. But if you have student loan debt, you can only claim the first $2,000 or $3,000, and then you can't do that after your income it hits $85,000 a year. So if you make more than $85,000 a year, you can no longer deduct your student loan debt. And again, you're looking at all the Black folks going to getting graduate degrees, and again, so where they might have an opportunity to make more than $85,000 a year, but they can't write off this interest in a way that homeowners, predominantly white, can write off these much larger percentage of mortgage deductions, and there is no income limit. So you can be a multi-millionaire and you still get to deduct all this interest, right? So we keep creating systems and structures, often, typically, predominantly by design, but not always by design, but the impact is the same. So it doesn't really matter. The intention to discriminate or be inequitable is irrelevant when the impact is one of inequity and injustice, and that's sort of where we are. And we're not going to be able to move beyond that. For Black folks, you see different numbers when you look at what it would take for Black folks to reach the median white wealth, and the numbers vary, but there is not a single number. No projection is under 100 years, and that's, again, absurd, especially when you factor in that it was the theft of this labor and the theft of this land from indigenous folks that enabled this wealth to exist in the first place.
Yep. That makes so much sense. And so it's really interesting when we think about it and how we should be thinking about when it comes to the deep roots, right? Because it's become such a recent topic, but a lot of times we're not really talking about, to your point earlier, about root cause, right? Versus
Yeah.
just sort of the symptoms and the things that we see today. What do you think people should be thinking about when it comes to dismantling the wealth gap,
I think
or unraveling the wealth gap, as well, I was going to say?
Yes, I think the core thing is going to the root causes, right? Again, to like slam financial literacy, nothing wrong with it, but that doesn't address these systemic issues. And I think at the core is a very, very popular solution in the Black community, much less so in the white community, varying levels in other communities of color, but reparations. I mean, reparations really is, and they could take sort of many forms. In my own opinion, I think there should be a financial aspect because these are financial ramifications that have existed. So that's one means, but also one that is a big lift. So I think that we're not going to see reparations on a national level anytime in the near future. However, we've seen some state-based options popping up here and there. California is near the end of this process of creating the reparations plan. And you might know California was not a slave state, was it? Well, California actually enabled slavery in many ways, including so if a Black person escaped from slavery from an enslaved state and was in California, and California was asked to help round them up, no problem, happy to do so. And of course, you have all the other broadly national policies that are racist that continue to exist in California. So Japanese Americans were able to get reparations ultimately from internment, but you look at sort of the wealth extraction that happened there too. It's bad enough that folks had their freedom taken away, but folks also lost their land, their housing, their businesses, which is something I hadn't thought about until recently, reading about a Japanese American guy. He's like, we had the best restaurant in town. We'd done all this, and we had things that no other restaurants had. We worked really hard to create this great restaurant, and the internment, it was gone. Somebody else was able to steal that land. So California has gone the furthest in looking at reparations, but there are other communities looking at reparatory efforts, including places like Tulsa. The Tulsa Wall Street massacre. One of the goals of the handful of survivors of that massacre is to get reparations set up of life. Well, first life, then land, property, all that happened. I think Tulsa's probably pretty well known now. More so, fortunately, with that was the Watchmen TV show, and I think it was on HBO with Regina King. Started this dramatic scene of these airplanes bombing a community, and the Watchmen is very much a fictional piece. It's an alternative history, but that bombing, including planes firebombing a community, really did happen in Tulsa. It really did happen because the instigating factor wasn't Black wealth, but it was because there are these wealthy Black folks living their best lives. Black, not just homeowners, movie theater owners, Black schools, Black pilots with their own planes, and then you had what was widely accepted to be a false accusation of like an accident where a young Black man stumbled into a white woman in an elevator. She screams, and then a lunch party goes out basically, and the whole town is demolished. So
Yeah.
but so they're looking at reparations. There's Tallahassee, Oklahoma is one of the oldest of Black communities that came up between the Civil War and the Depression, and they were booming. And again, sort of state policies help limit that community's capacity to be successful, And so they're now looking at a reparations effort to revitalize the town. And there's a whole group called Mayors Organized for Reparations and Equity now. They're looking to repair the harm done by generations of racist policy. So that's one piece. And again, those are all great. I'm glad they're happening, but the scale of the problem requires a national response, right? But as we work towards that, I think that sort of like ambitious and difficult goal, there are little things that can be done. Like Derek Hamilton, who is a professor at the New School in New York, and one of our board members at Americans for Financial Reform, has come up with the idea of baby bonds. So basically, every kid born in the U.S. gets $1,000 that is put aside to accrue for college or post until the person is 18 and allowed to do whatever they want with that money. But because of the wealth gap, that will disproportionately benefit folks of color. And so the disproportionate piece is one of the challenges with reparations, because like, oh, that's discrimination if you're only giving this to Black folks. Not that, there hasn't been literally, centuries of discrimination against Black folks in this country.
Right.
But there's some places who they've looked at, let's revise our tax policies to make sure that they're equitable, so that you don't have this imbalance where folks of color end up not being able to benefit as much as white folks, as with these potentially inadvertent things like the way the marriage tax works, right? If you're one person making $100,000, you have the same tax rate as two people making $50,000 each, which sounds like, oh, that's still legal, that's legit, and that's fair. But typically, one person making $100,000 who has a stay-at-home partner has greater access than two people working $50,000 jobs and sort of struggling. So there are all kinds of tax structural changes we can make. And then broader changes that affect and benefit everyone, regardless of race, who's working class and low income. So capping CEO pay,
Yeah.
executive compensation. Apparently, Netflix just decided today or yesterday that actually they didn't decide. The shareholders said, you know what,
Yeah.
this $206 million bonus package you're passing for 3 or 4 people, while all these writers are out on strike, maybe that's not a good look. Maybe that money can be reinvested to the writers who are doing the heavy lifting of the
Yeah.
work. And then there are also tiny things. There's also a gap in who's banked, and the Black communities, especially, but in other folks of color, have less access to traditional banking, which means reliance on less traditional banking, and so there are efforts to reinstate postal banking, which existed in this country until the early 50s, where you can go into a post office and get not just a money order, but just do your basic banking, cash your checking, and do it without sort of a minimal fee, as opposed to these banks where their aim is to profit. The post office is a public service, right? We all pay for the post office. We should all be able to benefit from it, and we should all have access to financial systems that aren't predatory and solely profit based.
This is really good. It's like you said, it's a lot of things to think about when it comes to the racial wealth gap, which I appreciate you giving that feedback. I know that as part of your work on Take a Wall Street, you created a website titled "Is Our Economy Fair?" Right? Because I guess when we think about the racial wealth gap, we have to think, or we should think about the systems that have created that gap. I think a lot of times we
Yeah.
try to address the racial wealth gap on the individual level. And as
Yes.
much as I am a big proponent for financial education, financial literacy,
Yeah.
we can't have this conversation about it without addressing the larger systems that is our economy, that is our government, and all these things that have been created. So I wanted to ask if you could tell our listeners a little bit about that website. What types of tools and resources would they find, and what was the onus for creating the site?
Absolutely. No, isourEconomyFair.org is the name of the site, and I'm really, really proud of it. It's a pretty interactive site, and I think it's also just really aesthetically engaging with data that's compelling, that traces the history of wealth extraction in the U.S. from colonization to the present day. So it leans more heavily on history, but you sort of starts off with the first, colonists arriving in what became Virginia, and their interaction with the Powhatan tribe, and the decimation of that community, and the decimation of that community, which also meant the wealth creation for the elite there, because then suddenly they have land, right? And it goes all the way through. It mentions some of the things that I've said already today about looking at the New Deal and how that really created the white middle class, but didn't do much to benefit Black folks or other communities. And it gives a context, really. It connects the prison industrial complex that we have today to that prison leasing system that emerged immediately after slavery. It looks at sharecropping, sort of debt peonage, where, okay, if you were lucky enough not to have been imprisoned, but sharecropping meant, so you're working the farm for someone else's land, and they set it up the same way that mining towns would do it, where like, oh, well, thanks for all your payments, but you actually cost us this much, so your debt is, we're going to increase the amount we have to charge you for this. They're always horrible contracts. They're not real contracts, right? So basically making it impossible for people to ever get ahead, just keeping them in debt, no matter how successful their crops have been, so like, buying them for lower rates, what have you. So that's what Is Our Economy Fair takes folks through.
Yeah.
And it came up from, as I mentioned, I'm a popular educator and was super excited about having this role of this organization. And about 6 months into my position, just as I was getting my feet under myself and ready to move forward, March 2020 happened, and we suddenly all went inside.
Yeah.
And popular education is really meant to be done in person, but because of the degree of interactivity and engagement. So I was trying to figure out a way. What do we do now? How do we move this work forward without being able to host meetings in person? And is there economy fair? It emerged from what used to be a single activity. Is the most visually engaging activity we have, which is called a gallery walk, which now we call it gallery viewing, just to make it less ableist. But you'd have in an image and some text on a poster board on the wall, and you sort of walk or move around 12 or 15 sheets to absorb what was happening. And so, okay, well, we're going to convert that activity to something that can be done online. And it occurred to us that since it's going to be online, it can serve the dual purpose. It can be used in a popular education context, which again is part of a collective, is right. So folks engaging in learning, co-learning, co-teaching, but it also can just be straight political education, because people don't have to do that in a context where like it's got twofold. So people who just want to learn a bit more about the evolution of wealth extraction in the U.S., about how gendered and raced these financial disparities have been, can just do that independently. But organizations, they're saying, look, we want to figure out how to fight back against the corporate landlords that are buying up all the housing in our community, and so suddenly housing prices are going up, so people can't buy housing, which then pushes people into renting, so rents go up, and this is all sort of part of like private equity organizations or companies primarily buying. They did this right after 2000. There were, I forget, 200,000 Blackstone bought around 200,000 housing units during the financial crisis, because
Okay.
housing was cheap, and then they
Yep.
use that to become really bad landlords and charge people really high rates. And so if people are saying like, hey, we want to fight, we want to improve conditions in our apartment complex, and they
Yep.
immediately go to the complex with the manager and like, oh, actually, that's not where the buck stops. The buck stops actually with this private equity company. So we work with folks to help them sort of see the financial actors who might be accountable for some of the situations they're in.
To my next question, just wanted to, as we kind of round out the conversation, how did you become passionate about financial reform, right? So Kia went from community organizing specifically and sort of starting to focus a little bit more into the world of financial reform through things of the website of Is the Economy Fair? Tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about what that journey has been like for you.
Sure. The funny thing is, because I'm a generalist, I like a little bit about a lot of things. And then there are some areas that I feel like I know a fair amount about. And I thought like economic justice was one of those areas. When I was up in philanthropy, that was the area that I did funding. And so I'm like, I get community land trusts and affordable housing efforts and like workers' rights and all this. And then I come to this organization and I learned about private equity, and it just blew my mind. And it continues to blow my mind. So I'll have to explain private equity here, because I certainly didn't have a clear understanding of it when I joined the
No, please.
organization.
And I'm
And
sure, yeah, the general American doesn't as well.
yeah, and I'm happy to explain it, but I also want to flag for folks because they say like, "Wait, that doesn't sound right." Maybe she misspoke. No, this is real, and it's scary. So private equity companies sort of come together, and their aim is really short term profit. They want to get a return on their investment in 5 to 8 years, sort of to close out that buyout. So I'm going to use one example that I think most folks can relate to. Explain how it works. So when Toys R Us went down, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago now, I think most of the narrative that I heard was like Amazon, right? It makes sense that online retailers, especially Amazon, can have cheaper prices. Brick and mortar stores can't compete as much. Not at all true. But then there's like, we need to figure out how to be more profitable, so we'll let a private equity firm buy us. So Toys R Us at the time was worth $5 billion. This collection of private equity firms and a hedge fund, so two private equity companies and a very similar model hedge fund came together to buy Toys R Us. And what they did, so the private equity managers put down somewhere between 3 and 10% of their own money to make a deal. The next chunk of money they get is from, honestly, potentially from some of us, because it's from pension plans, pension retirement accounts, public investments, university endowments. So organizations who are trying to grow their investments, and so they get a big chunk from those institutions. But the bulk of it, they take out a $5 billion loan to cover the rest. And that loan doesn't go on the private equity firm's books, it goes on Toys R Us's books. So you take out a loan, but you don't have to pay for it. The company you just bought now is in dollars. And so the way the private equity makes their money, aside from return of the investment, making their ownership piece, the other way is they have these ridiculous fees. So they put so $5 billion is now added to Toys R Us's books, not to the private equity firm's books. And then the firm's like, oh hey, it's fee time. I'm like, oh, looks like y'all can't afford it right now. Well, what you have to do is sell the land you own, because most retail companies own their land. So Toys R Us sells this land to pay its fees to the private equity companies. In the meantime, that gives them more debt, right? So now Toys R Us is paying a lease on the land that they didn't have to do before because they own the land. And then comes another round of fee payments due. I'm like, oh, you still don't, things are a little tight. Well, it looks like you're gonna have to do some layoffs. And so, like, basically, so the private equity model is just to buy something, you sort of like strip it dry. You take all the equity and worth out of it, milk it dry, use that equity to, to their benefit. And when I say to their benefit, the other investors, the pension plans and the university endowments, what have you, their return on investment has typically been inflated by the industry. In fact, they're not really getting a great return, but the big private equity firms, they're making out like gangbusters. So they're doing super well. In the meantime, Toys R Us, which I want to say was one of the biggest employers of women and of color in the U.S. until it collapsed. So during this whole debacle, they're stripping away severance that people were owed. They're stripping away, so like it's just a horrible model, and it was illegal. They're called leverage buyouts back in the 80s, and they were illegal until I want to say Reagan. Because how do you buy something and then you take on debt that you were not responsible for, that you can make another entity responsible for, and then so all you're doing is reaping benefits. So when I learned how private equity worked, I was really fired up about that. And then I discovered, oh, so it's not just Toys R Us, it's Kmart, it's Cirque du Soleil, it's in housing. Nursing homes now are becoming increasingly private equity owned, and you won't be surprised to hear that
I
their
did not know
mortality
that.
rates,
Wow.
yeah,
I
and
did
their
not know
mortality
that about
rates are
nursing homes.
skyrocketing at private equity owned nursing homes. Emergency rooms are now being increasingly private equity owned, and we're actually working with Alliance. I forget the name, but Alliance of Emergency Room Doctors, who are like, hey, I can't do my work with these requirements they're putting on us. If I've only got like 6.5 minutes per patient, or that's, I mean, they're in emergency rooms and beyond. But in any case, doctors are getting really concerned. Basically, if you hear that private equity has bought something you care about,
Yep.
you should expect that thing will be gone soon. About a year ago, P and Van was bought by a private equity firm, and I forget what they stand for, but they do a lot of the back end organization fundraising for Democratic candidates.
Mm-hmm.
So like being able to manage the pull the walk list, the voter list, to see the voting records, to look at neighborhood lists by precinct to figure out how you go to do targeting of the folks you want to turn out to vote and to get to support your candidate. It's been the primary supporter until about a year ago, was bought by private equity, and come 2024, it's gonna really. I'm really hoping that people are already working right now to figure out what to do as a backup, because they've already started laying off huge swaths of their staff. So they're not going to be able to have the capacity that's had in prior years, and that's really going to hamper Gal the Vote efforts by, again, this farm that was predominantly working for Democrats. So like PetSmart, now owned by private equity, and so you had all these incidents of different stores of pets dying because, again, the goal is to suck it dry, suck it whatever organization, whatever company dry, to direct those profits to those who have invested the least financially, but who have the power because of the structure of the private equity model. So yeah, when I just started getting a sense of how it is, I mean, I don't know that I've encountered any sort of industry where private equity doesn't have a foothold, and it's especially disturbing in cases with nursing homes and other sort of healthcare settings. I mean, it's disturbing anywhere, but the fact that people are literally dying because private
Yeah.
equity owns them. So that got me really fired up, and now I'm just an anti-private equity evangelist, and that's not even the team I work on. That we have a private equity team. It's not even my work, but
Yep.
it's so widespread and so nefarious and such an absurd model that it's like, wait, can I go buy your house now and then put that mortgage back on your books and not have to worry about it? I mean that's it's just ridiculous as that.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Ericka, you've given us so much really good, meaty information, an amazing history too of a lot of these things. And so, what do you want our listeners to take away from today's conversation?
I would encourage folks. I think one of the biggest things, especially about financial reform, is that the terms that are used, the way things are explained, are intentionally confusing, right? They're intimidating, for a reason, because we're not supposed to know, we're not supposed to understand, because when we look under the rock and see what's going on, we're like, oh, hey, this is not all right. So we want to try not to be intimidated and to look for resources where where people are breaking things down. So there's our organization, Take on Wall Street. It's at takeonwallstreet.org. Our mother organization, Real Bank Reform.org, is the address for Americans for Financial Reform. We have a private equity site as well for our private equity campaign. And I want to make sure that, and that's the stopwallstreetlooting.org. And I think also I'd encourage people to take a moment and and really dive into folks who are doing deep historical analyses of how we got here and what the background is. So I would highly recommend Black AF History by Michael Harriot. Michael Harriot is a really good writer, really great, a historian of the hidden, and was the unofficial godfather of Black Twitter at one point. And so that's a book that just came out in October, and it really dives in. It's the unwhitewashed history of America, which gives a lot of context about how things came to be. And he also has a podcast called Drapetomaniacs, DRAPETOMANIAX. So Drapetomaniacs, based on drapetomania, which was a disease that a doctor created during slavery, to say like, oh, well, people are running away from this amazing enslavement. There must be something wrong with it. There must be a disease. I'm going to call it drapetomania. So Drapetomaniacs has a new podcast.
Okay.
I encourage folks to look at isourEconomyFair.org, our
Yeah.
website.
All right.
And yeah.
Okay. Well, you've given us a lot of good links to review. And then if people want to learn a little bit more about popular education and what your organization is doing around there, any resources that you would suggest them review?
Yeah, there's actually Forge Organizing is a great website designed for organizers, but it has a lot of popular education materials on there, on the site. The Center for Story-Based Strategy isn't really about popular education explicitly, but it also is very good about sort of shaping stories and helping folks understand, and so breaking down sort of things that are intentionally complex, so that they can be more understandable. And then also I encourage folks to follow us on X for the time being anyway, at Real Bank Reform, and at Take on Wall ST for that.
Okay. Cool. Thank you so much. And so what's next for you? Any upcoming projects or campaigns, things that you want to highlight?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like I've actually taken on a new role in my organization. So I'm doing part pop ed and part acting chief of staff. So what I'm doing right now, if anybody's going to be at the Women's Convention in Milwaukee this weekend, one of my colleagues and I will be there doing a workshop on reclaiming the economy from the wealthy elite.
Okay.
Although I imagine that's going to be too soon. That's not taking 2 days. Probably that will have happened by the time this airs. But I think the big focus for me right now is knowing that nothing is going to change and move into the current Congress. Certainly not even having House leadership.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important for us as an organization to work with grassroots folks, because I don't think this is sort of common knowledge. So for folks who are part of community organizations or labor organizations or any sort of entity or church, like we could really benefit to learn. We'd love to learn more. Or there's a particular issue that we're finding or trying to figure out, and we'd love to see what the intersection is there. Folks should always absolutely feel free to reach out to me, or by phone. All that information is on our website.
Okay.
And my email, I can just say, is Ericka, ERICKA,
Uh-huh.
at ourfinancialsecurity.org. That will be different in a couple months. We're actually revising our website, and I think we're going to be changing the web address, but you'll get redirected anyway.
Yeah, we'll get it out before then. Well, thank you so much, Ericka. Thank you for giving all your social links and how folks can contact you. You gave us a lot of really great resources, and mostly a really rich and robust conversation around the wealth gap. I'm so excited to have had you on, and look forward to continuing to following all the great work that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great being in conversation with you, and you have a great podcast. I'm looking forward to continue to follow it as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's all for today, folks. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.